Okay, here we go. Hey, here again to have another conversation. Conversations between Asian Americans as we process uh, recent events in the United States, or really potentially broader than the United States too. But AAPI hate, this coronavirus, and that during that time, during this time, it's also had that sort of Wuhan China virus, all these race ways that added to some um, racism that wasn't just started then. We've experienced that before, but it's also a moment after that Atlanta shooting that's sort of a reckoning for a lot of us to really wrestle with our identity as Asian Americans. And I met Danny the other day, and Danny, I know you're involved with InterVarsity, which is an organization that um, no organization is perfect, but I do respect a lot of what InterVarsity has done as a campus ministry organization. Yeah, I just wanted to hear your perspective. I know you're down in a different part of the United States, down in Florida, but yeah, I want to hear how you are processing with other people, how people down there are processing, and yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. So my name is Danny Chen. I work for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. I'm the area director down here in sort of Central Florida. I'm in Orlando, and I oversee about 30 campuses kind of across the Central Florida area. Yeah, so I think you mentioned that it's a pretty unique place to be. So I'm not originally from Florida. I was born in Chicago, where there's a lot of Asian Americans, but my parents also raised me uh, in a very sort of uh, typical, like third culture kid kind of experience. So, growing up, I was basically straddling between Chicago and Taiwan throughout my whole entire adolescence. So I think that just gave me a lot of perspectives around always always being sort of finding myself in the space that is in between, and having to learn the skills to tactfully navigate through different contexts, different dynamics, different cultural settings from a very young age. So, when I eventually ventured my way down to the southern United States, I think I wouldn't say it's as much of a culture shock, but it was just it was a unique experience of displacement that I perhaps hadn't experienced before, in certain contexts that really highlighted a lot of my thinking and growing and learning around racial dynamics, particularly here in the United States, considering all the history that went into it, and also uniquely being Asian American, sort of caught in a majority of historical narrative that's between black and white. Um, yeah, so I think the recent events really got me to do a lot of thinking, and but particularly the shootings in Atlanta that happened almost 2 weeks ago prompted me to do some writing and telling some stories around just some family history stuff that sort of garnered a lot of attention unexpectedly. So I had a Facebook post that sort of went viral, and next thing I knew, I was being interviewed on a news station here locally. I was being interviewed on different podcasts. I got invited to speak at a vigil commemorating all the anti-Asian violence, and now I'm doing this. So there's been a lot of just different things that I have been able to sort of step into, and I feel that it's important. I think it's the perspectives that I'm telling, even though it's a story from my own family to begin with. I think this has gotten much bigger than myself now, And I think for a people group as Asian Americans that have sort of historically been silenced, been ignored, been voiceless, it feels like it's important for us to take every platform we can to tell our stories, to share our voice before the spotlight is inevitably moved on to other bigger breaking news stories. And that's why I'm taking advantage of kind of speaking out and speaking out right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, why don't you just continue there? I mean, tell us about this kind of more personal narrative that
Sure.
you're thinking about, and then I'm also curious, further down the road because you are with InterVarsity.
Yep.
I know they're pretty. They they try to really within the orbit of Christian, thoughtful Christian engagement. They do try to think about race in a
Mhm.
more complex way than a lot of other organizations. So maybe you
Sure.
can kind of hit some of those things. Yeah.
Yeah. So the family story that I really sort of um, shared on social media, and even even if I'm thinking about it right now, it's still I find myself still inevitably having this hesitancy in telling it, just because first off, for those of us that come from Asian backgrounds, it's a shame based culture, it's a shame honor dynamic. So uh, a lot of times when we're telling stories, there is this acute awareness of how it doesn't just impact myself, even though it's a family story. And none of my family on that side of the family speak enough English to even know that I'm doing this. So but I think there is kind of this very real concern on not wanting to unintentionally bring shame to anybody. I want to honor my family as much as I can. But here it goes, right? So the gist of the story is I found out 2 summers ago that my grandmother on my father's side had basically had to endure a season in her life working as a sex worker in a massage parlor in order to take care of her kids. So the backstory behind that was that my grandmother was born into poverty in sort of the post-war era in Taiwan, and she began to as she was growing up, she out of her 10 siblings, her birth parents decided to sell her to another family, to literally be the daughter of another family, because they I guess her father had sort of accumulated that very significant transition in her life as a young girl. I can only imagine the kind of psychological damage that um, why was I the person that my family didn't want? Why was I the one daughter chosen out of the 10 siblings that I had to be kind of sold to another family? So, I think all of that could impact the kind of life that she would have later on, right? So, fast forward a little bit into her adolescence when she became a young woman. Um, I don't know the exact backstories of how this happened because my family does not talk about it a whole lot. But from what I do know is that she ended up getting involved with a married man. She was almost kind of taken in as like a mistress. And I think this man perhaps already had multiple partners. But, you know, whatever circumstantial things happen in life, that's where she ended up. And as she was taken in as this mistress, this man fathered 3 kids with her, the oldest one being my father. So this man was essentially my grandfather, but none of us have ever had a relationship with him because of the nature of their parenthood to these 3 kids was out of sort of an illegitimate marriage. And remember, we're talking about old-fashioned shame-based society. That family never recognized these kids or my grandmother as their own. And I think my grandfather had passed away when my father was still pretty young. So after after his passing, this family basically kicked them to the curb. They had uh, no claims to the family, no ties to the family. They just abandoned them. And I remember hearing stories from my uncle, from my and telling about, because this they start opening up, talking about their childhood a little bit more, even after my dad had passed away. But when they were kids, they were made fun of by other people, by other kids, even by their own sort of birth family, as like, you guys are illegitimate bastards. You guys don't have a real family. You guys won't make anything out of yourself. So so it's that kind of backdrop, that my grandmother became a single mother to these kids and needing to basically figure out a way to take care of them. Now, granted, she was not educated because girls in that era did not have sort of the eligibility to receive education and things like that. So she couldn't read, she couldn't write, her skills were limited. So basically, she had to turn to the oldest job, the oldest profession in humanity, which is selling her body for money. So she ended up being in a massage parlor, basically doing shameful, work around sex work, where she allowed strange men to basically come and exploit her body in order to put food on the table, to have money to put food on the table to raise her kids. So, I think this is kind of the family background that I never learned of until a couple years ago, because nobody talked about it. And the reason why I decided to sort of start talking about it and sharing it in a more public sphere is because of the nature around what happened in Atlanta 2 weeks ago. Right now, I want to be clear that nobody, and there has been no confirmation that any of the women killed were in fact sex workers. But I think that does not matter as much as to the public perception of these types of industries that is particularly highly tied to a certain race or ethnicity, right? So I just wanted to tell this part of the story of my own family history to sort of give a face to the humanity of the people that were killed, because the reality is, whether they're sex workers or not, many patrons that visit these kinds of establishments are expecting a certain type of sexual favor. So I think it's easy for us, particularly, might I even say Christian society, to look at these types of establishment with a certain type of social stigma, right? I think women that work in these industries are oftentimes seen as, morally loose or sexually promiscuous, or just, people that are working in dark rooms doing shady business. And I wanted to give the humanity of the fact that, these people are also mothers, daughters, somebody's sisters, who very likely are finding themselves in a life predicament because of other systemic injustices that sort of have to force them to figure out a way to find anything that they could do in order to take care of their families. So I think we oftentimes don't talk about the idea that women in these situations are oftentimes abused by their employers, by their customers, by the law enforcement, by, in many instances, sex traffickers, human traffickers. So, so I think before we're able to kind of look at this particular incident objectively, I think it's good to enter into the context of, how some of these women have ended up in these positions, and to remember that they too are human beings created with dignity, whose bodies reflect the image of God. So I just want to caution, anybody, particularly our Christian listeners, to remember that and to see that before we assign judgment. So that's kind of where my story started. I started telling the story. And then to sort of continue to move forward and look at this entire incident from the many different angles and the many different layers that I feel like the media has thus far simplified to something that is not telling the whole story, not showing the whole picture of the story.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's the first time I've probably heard a personal story like that, and it's powerful.
Yeah, and the thing is, right, I think with our culture, it's such a, with a story with that kind of nature, it's so difficult for people to share it. And since I written that post and it has gone out to, literally thousands of people, and I'm, hearing from strangers that have read my stories that have also shared that, this very similar thing happened to my grandmother, this very similar thing happened to my mother. So I think it's a lot more common than we think.
Yeah.
But as a society, particularly as a culture that come from, kind of more traditional Asian settings, it's something that most families keep in the dark, because it's nothing to brag about.
Well, and that's the double edge, right, of the whole honor shame society. I think sometimes those of us who have this, you know, borrowing from like W.B. Du Bois, like the double consciousness. I know that's not Asian Americans different, but like as the Asian consciousness and the American, like the fact that you could imagine sharing the story, and dignifying it in a different way,
Right.
it's a strange thing, and it's not to downgrade or say that honor shame ways of relating to things is evil or bad, but it's a double-edged sword, right? Because
Right.
because it can make it very difficult. Like, I mean, like I think a lot of people are recognizing the challenge, even just zooming out from your particular story, which is amazing. But for like you were started out with the need for Asian Americans to have a bigger voice, that breaking out from that is perhaps something that we could only imagine because we're Asian Americans, right?
Yeah.
And even then, I think it's a rare voice within Asian Americans that does sort of break out and find a seat at the table. You're talking about white and black.
Sure. Yeah. And, and even since I've told the story, I've been getting a lot of encouragement and words of support, and also folks that have sort of wanting to affirm me in such a way by saying like, oh, you definitely did not bring shame to your family. Like you definitely honor your grandmother. But I think even that comment is coming from such a sort of Western lens of looking at things, right? Because I think what people are missing here in terms of what I did is essentially, in order to tell this story that has been kept for generations, my father never talked about it. Even though this level of sacrifice was done particularly in order for his survival when he was being raised as a child, right? And his mother never really talked about it. And I'm choosing to tell this story after both my grandmother and my father have already passed away. So in essence, there is a sense in me that feels like in order to tell this story and to impact and to shed light and to give dignity to people that I don't even know, what I'm choosing to do almost is throwing my father and my grandmother under the bus a little bit, because this is something that they had no say in whether or not they want this to be shared publicly, right? Yeah. But so I feel like the risk that I took was to share their story in such a way where my goal is to honor women, particularly that are in this kind of context that are oftentimes unseen. Yeah. So, yeah.
It reminds me of a newer Asian American a film like The Farewell. Yes. Because of the culture clash, right? Where
Yep.
The Honorable Lie. Mm-hmm. You have to watch it to know what we're talking about. But The Honorable Lie. This is the flip side where they hide from the grandmother that she's even sick.
Right.
And from what I've been told, I think that grandmother's still alive, but she actually ended up watching the film and now she knows that she's not sick. But it's fascinating. I mean, and that's a cultural and ethical clash in some ways.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's wrong, but in this culture, and it's so such a big clash. And I think that's one of the reasons why, right? It's so difficult. People don't understand it's apples and oranges to compare the racial groups here in the United States. Black, brown,
Yep.
Brown, it's about the immigrant experience much differently, the border and all of those political debates.
Sure.
The Black experience, 400 years, right?
Yep.
But we have a unique experience, as I like to say. It's a very challenging to think about East versus meets West.
Yep.
Think about, you're third generation. Are you third generation?
I was born here. Yeah, it's kind of, I kind of call myself like a 1.5, right? I think there's even different definitions that people use for first versus second generation.
Right.
So typically somebody like me will be called a second generation because I'm the first generation born here,
Right.
whereas the first generation is my mother's generation who immigrated, right? But even my upbringing, I feel like, there is out of all my cousins, right? I was the only one that was sort of like brought back to the motherland, and to have kind of this formative experience straddling between both worlds. So so oftentimes I feel like it's a unique like 1.5 generation.
Can you help us understand that a little bit more? I mean, because getting to be over, because I've been to Taiwan several times. My grandparents still live there.
Yep.
And I understand, first time I went there, it's like, oh yeah, cool night markets,
Exactly.
I recognize that was different from China,
Sure.
in terms of seem more developed in certain ways. But yeah, help us understand that.
Yeah.
And as part of your being Asian American, but also Asian American,
Yeah, definitely. So man, so when I think back to my upbringing, I feel like the best way to describe that is I felt like my my sense of ethnic identity had always been on this very extreme pendulum swing, because there have been moments in my life where I felt deeply ashamed of, being this ethnically Chinese person, to moments where I felt arrogantly prideful over my Asian identity. And when you really think about it, when I really think about it, I think what was driving those, extreme swings from one end to the other, almost always come back to this idea of survival. It's like, how did I have to feel about myself in order to survive? And I think for many of us Asian Americans, survival oftentimes looks like, what do we do to fit in? What do we do to actually feel the sense of belonging? Right. So, before so just a little timeline breakdown, right? I was born here in the US. At age 3 was when I was moved back to Taiwan. And from age 3, basically through, like preschool, elementary school, and middle school. So from 3 through 14, I was spending the school year in Taiwan and spending all my summers in Chicago. And then starting at age 14, we flipped. So I started high school in Chicago and then spent the summers in Taiwan. So that was my reality all the way until, I graduated high school at 18 and then went off to college, which is a whole nother season of my life that has, a lot more other revelations to my identity as well. But in those first, 18 years of my life, I feel like I didn't have the language or the name to call it, but thinking back and really examining what it was is actually a recognition of what privilege looks like in sort of society in general. And I say that because it became pretty apparent to me at a young age that for me as a Taiwanese person in Taiwan, holding a US citizenship meant that I had a certain level of privilege that others don't, right? And I think this was in the 80s. And 80s, if you know the history of sort of East Asia in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was a large influx of immigrants coming over to the US. So for me to have been born in the US and holding a US citizenship meant that I had certain access to things that my sort of fellow countrymen didn't have. So as a kid, I think any kid wants to know what makes them special, what makes them stand out. That's just human nature. So for me, like, oddly enough, it was this thing around my citizenship. I always wanted to make sure that other people around me knew that I wasn't exactly the same as them. Like I have this U.S. citizenship, and I can go to America whenever I want to, and sort of like turn my back on the old ways. So kind of this really arrogant thing. But I think deep down inside, I was feeling some type of a shame around the idea that like these other people who are supposed to be my people, they're just Chinese, or they're just Taiwanese. They're not Chinese American, right? So it's weird, right? And I think when you have a limited understanding of that kind of feeling mixed with like race and ethnicity and things like that, I think for me, I saw I saw being, or like the pursuit of being white as like a good thing. So, I just felt like that's my goal, because, you know, people still see me as this Chinese person, but if I want to really make it and survive and fit in and belong in America, then, I need to be able to come across as white passing in the way that I carried myself. So that, nobody taught me that. My parents, thinking back, my parents were probably completely oblivious to that these were the inner struggles in my own psyche, being brought up, thinking about these things, and oftentimes in a language that my parents were not fully proficient in either. So there's nobody really to guide me through that, right? And I remember there was this one particular incident that I would consider as very pivotal to my sense of identity. Was, one of the summer. So like the summer times when I got to come to America, those were like the most exciting times. I was always super excited, ready to hang out all summer with my cousins. Going back to Taiwan was always like a painful memory, because I'm like, school's much longer, teachers are much stricter. It's just no fun, right? Like America felt like summer camp to me, and Taiwan felt like, some kind of imprisonment to me growing up. So I remember one summer as I landed in Chicago, and we were like coming out to meet my family that came to pick us up. This was like way back before 9/11, where your family could sort of like walk up to you and pick you up right from the gate. And I remember just me being excited and ready to spend a whole summer having fun. I remember two of my cousins came to pick us up that year, and I remember hearing one of them saying to the other, jokingly, of course, here comes our fob cousin. And if you're not familiar with the term fob, it's, fresh off the boat. It's almost kind of like this joking, but really kind of derogatory ways that Asian Americans view those who aren't Asian Americans, those who are just Asians. So I think for me, man, like that was a heavy blow to me, because I felt like in my life feeling like already with this mindset of like, man, why do I have to be so Chinese when the rest of my family don't? Like, why did we all immigrate here? And me being the only one that has to kind of go back to this place that everybody so desperately try to leave. And then like hearing sort of this joke in my own family, man, that just, I think, set off a course for me to sort of vow to myself that, hey, I'm going to work as hard as I can to never speak with an accent where people can tell that I didn't grow up here. That I'm going to, basically do whatever I can to make sure that I am as American as one can be. Right. So, man, like, so, you can see the inner workings of that. Like, there is something that's deeply shameful about me having to look like this, but kind of having this false hope of like, if I work hard enough, then I can rid myself of this and actually like belong. Right. So fast forward a little bit, when things kind of flipped during high school and I came over, we were in a pretty wealthy, like Chicago suburban high school. So with that, it means that the demographics of the school was mostly white, with the largest minority group as being Asian Americans, mostly Chinese Americans and Korean Americans. So, and I remember because of that, and this was the late 90s, early 2000s, there wasn't any Black or Latino students at my school, maybe like two, and they're like part of the same family, that kind of thing. So there was almost like a prideful expression of the Asian Americans sort of being kind of the hip minority kids, and this was during a time when, a lot of our people were getting into hip hop and breakdancing. And,
We were the people of color at that
we
point.
were the people of color at my high school in that particular context, especially in the absence of Black and Latino people, right? So yeah, so we were breakdancing, like a lot, not me, but a lot of the people that looked like me, drove their souped up import cars. We had sort of this hallway where all the Asian kids hung out. There were two cafeterias in this school. One is where all the cool Asian kids and the lame white kids ate, and then the other one is where all the like white kids that are like football players and cheerleaders ate, and only like the nerdy lame Asian kids ate in there. So there was like a very particular way in which we were pretty segregated based on our social circles and cliques and things like that. So all of a sudden, I think everything in terms of how I viewed my identity came to a halt, because in those high school years, and we all know how like shallow high school is, right? But in those high school years, like for the first time in my life, I saw that like, wow, like actually elevating the distinction of us being Asian Americans got us somewhere. Like we're actually cool, we're the kids that are like breakdancing in the school prep rally or pep rally, or halftime show during a basketball game and things like that. So all of a sudden, like for me, I wanted to be, I wanted to basically be like, this is my people. Like we're Asian Americans. We're not white. We have the cool fade haircuts with the spiky hair, and a few of us have the random bangs coming off the side. You remember those days, right? So, so it was, it was a time where I just began to really explore much deeper into kind of what does it look like to actually celebrate who I am, in such a way where it became problematic pretty quickly, because that sense of identity also wasn't very holistic. It was this idea of like, man, like to fit in now, to belong now means that I fully embrace everything that Asian America is making us be in that era. And we get to feel like maybe we're superior and better than everybody else, at least for a season. So, that's the huge pendulum swing, right? So I really think that this more holistic embrace of my ethnic identity did not materialize until I came to college. And so, after high school, I left Chicago. I went down to a small town in North Carolina for college. And a lot of people ask me, how does an Asian kid end up in a place like that? So the one thing that's not super traditional about my parents, because my dad was an educator, is that he actually believed in the pursuit of what you feel like most passionate about. So there was not a academic pressure for me to be a doctor or a lawyer like many Asian American students. So I grew up in Taiwan, small island surrounded by the ocean. I'm an only child, so like my parents didn't give me siblings. So I grew up with a bunch of pets and stuff. So I think those are some of the ingredients that gave me this passion of like when I started to think about what I wanted to study. I wanted to study marine biology. I want to hang out with animals in the sea. So I left Chicago and went to a school in Wilmington, North Carolina, that was like ranked number 5 in the country for marine biology. So that's where I went. But man, this school was like 95% white, 5% black. And if you're not black or white, people look at you and just automatically assume that you have most definitely have to be a foreigner. So a lot of these folks have never even left their home state. So, this is the period of my life where I began to experience microaggression in a way where, or when I didn't even know what microaggression was. It's just, I was constantly presented with statements or questions where I was like mind blown on how people think that way. But, in my sort of like naive innocence, I entertained it. And I was not as cynical as I may be now around microaggression, right? So, but I think particularly in the context of my faith development, this was a season where I began to explore different churches, different campus ministries. Again, being in the Bible Belt in the South, like, I was not lacking any options, to say the least. But I think what was really unique for me, though, what really drew me out of that season was there was something very different, as you mentioned, around my engagement with InterVarsity. So, with all the other ministries and churches I was a part of, it felt like there was this pretty high pressure to sort of assimilate to even the subculture of each group in order for me to like succeed. Whereas InterVarsity, like from the get-go, it was actually kind of uncomfortable, rather, because I think the discipleship model of InterVarsity really wanted to contextualize the ministry to draw out who we are already created to be and to kind of empower us in that context. And for me, being actually who I am had always been really uncomfortable for me. But there was something almost kind of sweet about it too, is that like who I actually am matters to these people for whatever strange reason. They actually want to know me, the real me, not the, multiple different faces that I've had to put on in order to fit in all my life. So I think that was kind of a pivotal point in this journey of reconciling my ethnic identity as something that God had purposefully sort of placed into my life, and there are deeper purposes that He wants to draw out from that, and the rest of it is history, right? I think InterVarsity kind of began this discipleship style for me that really became some of the most formative years of my adult life, that has influenced me into pursuing what I'm doing today. So obviously not a marine biologist anymore. I did work in that field for a few years, but I have since devoted to full-time ministry, kind of doing the very same thing that I had experienced with college students.
Yeah. And there's so much to unpack there, but
Yeah.
I mean, that's really fascinating. I mean, I'm really interested in your story, and I mean, I can resonate with just one thing. I can resonate with kind of the campus ministry as a time of both spiritual awakening and racial cultural awakening, in some sense. Man, I mean, so maybe can I just see if you could go a little further? I mean,
Sure.
now, in some ways, I imagine as an Asian American leader down in Florida, and as a voice within InterVarsity, which is trying to increasingly grow in its sort of, for lack of a better word, just diversity in every dimension. Um, um, yeah, I mean, in some ways, what's that like? I mean, I'm sure that I've known some friends that have worked in other campus ministry organizations that have been effectively their in-house DEI people, trying to help people that understand the organizations that were historically white, um, maybe founded in a certain era when there was a lot of these campus ministries in the United States, founded as a certain style of way of continuing the, mission movement in the United States, but founded as a pretty white, not intentionally, right? Just founded in a certain time and
Yep.
age, and have had some friends that are working for these organizations or consulting for these organizations, trying to help them become more diverse. So there's that angle of like speaking to the organization, but then also I imagine that probably you have Asian Americans that want to specifically relate to you,
Mm-hmm.
that are navigating their own complex journeys within the broader racial landscape. I mean, is that accurate? How would you describe that?
Yeah, I feel like that was even such a broad question. Like, do you have a specific kind of
Yeah,
angles you want to go?
I mean, well, I just know that. Yeah, I don't even know what to ask. I mean, I know that you're in that,
Mm-hmm.
and well, I could say, what's it like, or is there any particular struggles or challenges of
Sure.
forming those worlds of both trying to speak into the broader organization as well as sort of walking with
Yeah.
Asian American students,
Sure. Yeah.
or non-Asian American students, but within being mindful, attentive to each other's racial, cultural, ethnic
Absolutely.
identity.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think there's a couple of ways I can address that. Let me first speak into the context of kind of the uniqueness that I have been observing working in Florida in particular. Uh, so, Florida is not a typical state in comparison to the rest of the South, right? I think there is a lot of diversity here in Florida. When we look at the sort of the Black community here, it's not just limited to Black Americans in the South, but there's all kinds of people from African descent that have sort of come here by way of, Caribbean island nations, Afro-Caribbean, and even, Afro-Latinos, right? I think when we look at the Latino population here, it's not majority dominated in, say, in some other parts of the country where it's majority Mexican American, but we have all the Central, South American, Latin American nations, the Caribbean nations. So I think when we look at Florida, and particularly thinking about doing racial justice work in Florida, it's very easy for those who are in leadership positions to put a big fat check mark next to diversity. Um, but as an Asian American who's been pretty aware of these things most of my life, man, I feel like that is a continual sort of like assumption that we've already arrived, when the reality is that there's very, very little Asian voices being heard in decision making, in representation, in all different levels here in Florida. So I think part of my vision for being here in particular, I think to do the kind of work that I do, and particularly wanting to work around racial justice, ethnic identity development, and things like that. There are plenty of places that I can do that with plenty of Asian Americans. I always joke about how like California would be like a dream place for me to live, just because, perfect weather, perfect food. I love the oceans. I surf, and there's plenty of Asian Americans. But I think part of my decision to continue to feel convicted in staying here is because there's not really anybody like me here that is sort of fighting for our voice to be heard. And yet there is actually a huge population of Asian Americans that are in Florida. People may not think that, but we are here. I live just down the street from, downtown Orlando, an area that's highly populated with mostly Vietnamese and Chinese businesses. So yeah, there's just a lack of kind of awareness in knowing that, yeah, like our people are here. But I think it's easy for Florida to sort of just like, yeah, diversity, we got that, let's move on. So part of me being here is to do that. I think, but speaking in general and more broadly, for the rest of the country, in terms of all the different racial dynamics and particularly the racial trauma that we've been, observing in, several incidents, some high profile, some never even reported, going across the country. I think from a cultural lens, I would say that there are a couple of forces that are happening that sort of shape the way things are unfolding, right? Growing up with my father being a very sort of traditionally minded, educator, he always talked about, he referred a lot of his parenting to kind of Confucianistic teachings, right? So this idea that, as gentlemen, we don't, and I'm speaking that broadly, not just representing men, right? But as mature human beings, we don't solve our problems with our fists, but we solve our problems with our wisdom. We think, we communicate, we think through the different, 5 different relational dynamics that exist in society, right? These are all like Confucianistic principles. And to Asian people, really, it's not a religion, it's a philosophical thinking. It's like Plato or Socrates to the West, right? It's not, so I think oftentimes the West paints Confucianism as like a major world religion. That's not what it is for us. It's a is a set of philosophical thinking that has largely shaped the cultural dynamics of who we are.
Maybe more
Right?
equivalent to like the Proverbs, the Hebrew Proverbs or something like that.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So, but even the Hebrew Proverbs is in the context of like a religious establishment, right? I think it's better. It's better to almost think of Confucius not as a um well, I
Like
don't know what to
guru.
not.
Yeah.
I think the way that I grew up learning who Confucius was is simply that he was the first teacher in the Chinese culture. So like he's the first teacher who kind of came up with principles of education. So we all have a lot to learn from him. That's kind of the idea, you know what I mean? So but anyway, I think a lot of what we observe in Asian cultures, kind of this idea of like conformity, this idea of don't stick out, right? Even the Japanese proverb of, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. Um, this idea that, you know, don't go against the grains, like be a harmonious part of a larger community, conform to each other.
Which,
These are, yeah,
which seems so anti-American,
exactly.
because then it just sounds like you're unoriginal. You're
Hmm.
such a carbon copy of everyone else, and like,
Right,
can you ever imagine American TV show where
right.
it's like, hey, you know, sort of like, honor the
Yeah.
way of the whole, like, it just
Yes. So
it,
I think what we're largely speaking about is kind of the cultural worldviews that are different between what those of us in the East would call collectivism versus individualism in the West, right? So there is a celebration in the West of, individuality, kind of like, you know, charting your own course, right? And it's interesting, right? Because even when you look at Disney movies, I love this example. I stole this from one of our colleagues, Greg Howe. But when you look at classic Disney movies, right, almost all of them exclusively follow this narrative of there's this young person, they don't feel like they quite fit in with kind of the this like provincial life that they were set out to live. So they now need to like leave and have this sense of adventure to figure out their own life and come to this like realization of like coming of age and accomplishing something, right? Every Disney movie has that element to it, with the exception of Mulan, right? Mulan's adventure is not based on her own pursuit of something that she wants, right? Mulan's adventure comes from this like faithful obedience to her aging father and stepping into a position that is costly to herself in order to preserve her father from harm and danger and to bring honor to the family, right? So like that really highlights this idea of the two different worldviews between the East and the West. And I think when we're not living with a heightened awareness of that, then we start seeing that, we start seeing ourselves in light of like, oh, I don't know what's wrong with us. Our people never fight back. We never stand up for ourselves. This is all the reasons why we're easy target when it comes to this whole year of anti-Asian violence, right?
we're
But
just
it's not because
passive. We're just
Mhm,
passive. We don't actually care about injustice. We don't
mhm,
march, that kind of thing. Like,
exactly, yeah,
and Black people actually know, they
hmm,
actually understand the Hebrew prophetic tradition. We Asian Americans don't, that kind of thing, right?
right, yeah. So even I think even like in terms of like inter-minority relations, it's easy for us to be seen as the sellouts or the traitors, right? I think even this contributes to the model minority myth, right? This idea that like culturally we're already people that have been taught to keep our heads down, work hard, and don't complain, right? So like when that gets sort of manipulated by the larger narrative of white supremacy, it's very easy for Asian people to be now the new adopted favorite pets to white people, to
Yeah.
put it bluntly. You know what I mean? So then the tricky part of white supremacy then is that um, it keeps people of color, communities of color at war with each other. Like it puts communities of color against each other. You know, I recently had some pretty heated conversation with a member of my own family that feels like, you know, white supremacy is not the problem. Like all these news stories, all these incidents that we're seeing are, you know, Asian elders being attacked by Black teens. Are we seeing that? Absolutely. Like you can't deny that. Like a lot of these videos that we're watching is that, but I don't think that tells the full story, right? I think we need to actually consider the longer historical context of a people group, the Black community, that has been systemically oppressed for literally centuries. And that kind of oppression breeds a sort of desperation. And that kind of desperation easily turns into violence when you feel like you have no way out. And that violence easily gets pointed towards a easy target. People that don't fight back, people that have been told to keep their heads down, and people that have been shaped by a larger narrative that says, you know, everybody should be like them. If you're not like them, then you're just a bunch of lazy people of color that you're not working hard enough.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I
And
think
add on the layer of like, you know, the ones that actually have the businesses in those communities, partly because do people who are white want to live in those communities, in their community, you know, so then you have Asian business owners within the Black communities and all those
sure.
too.
Yep.
And you know, like you're saying, if you look at it from a microscope scale, it just looks like these people versus these people. But if you zoom out,
Exactly.
the puppets, right? I mean,
yeah. When you really zoom out, it's this is when the I think the most brilliant part of how, you know, I'm putting that in quotes, right? The most brilliant part of how white supremacy operates is that if you can somehow manipulate it in such a way where people, different communities of color are always at war against each other, then they will be too busy to actually dismantle what benefits from that, which is the continuation and the perpetuation of white supremacy.
right.
You know, so like if we continue to be kept in a system where we're just fighting against each other as communities of color, then white supremacy gets to continue to win. So, you know, I think that's the scary part that a lot of us don't see. And so I think for me, being able to have these platforms to speak out is I want Asian Americans to know that it is important for us to fight for justice. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to look exactly like the way other communities are doing it. But we also, but I think for the sake of misrepresentation, there is an effort that is needed for other communities of color to actually learn and understand what it looks like when we do choose to fight for it. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, maybe can I add to that? I think about in the Hebrew, you know, Hebrew tradition, they have a big consciousness, right? Remember in the Hebrew Bible, right? Always remember your story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about how, in some ways, whiteness or the broader thing, you know, you kind of erase your story or like who I am. I don't know who I am anymore. I'm American, and all this, the American story is just like upward, you know, American dream, upward mobility, whatever, right? And I'm just part of that. And then you sort of lose the broader story or narrative that you're in and heritage, and perhaps even that as a big part for us Asian Americans to learn and to be a part of the broader conversation, not by just leaving all that stuff behind, but recovering it so that others can learn about it. And you know, we were even talking about the East versus West. Do people need to learn from the virtues of the East?
Yeah.
Even people thinking about the Bible, we read it from a Western individualist lens, when it's much more honor shame oriented. So maybe we're actually going to better understand the Christian heritage too by that. And I just want to share one moment, right? So during our honeymoon, my wife and I went to Taiwan. So I'm actually, my wife's 23 generations Taiwanese. My family, my grandparents moved to Taiwan, you know, part of the Cultural Revolution stuff. So they would probably be more on the China side. So there's
that's my mom's side of the family too. So
there's a little bit of reconciliation.
Post-war Taiwanese. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so, but we went and visited my wife's family, a greater family, aunts and uncles and great aunts and uncles, and in this area in I'm forgetting what it was called, outside of Taichung. And but they had one of these, you know, the family homes I wish I could show you the picture right now. You know, just the elaborate wood architecture, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, you have like multiple families living in the different wings, right?
Yeah.
And the courtyard,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then in that area they had a shrine for uh, Liao. The Liao family was switched at one point, and there was another name. I forget what it was called. The other name.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like the other name and Liao, that
Mm-hmm.
family shrine, and it's just generations, and it has all the lists of the names in that. But
Mm-hmm.
also, you're talking about Confucian. They had these sort of these pictures, right? This painting kind of, I think it was wood carvings actually, that showed those Confucian principles.
Mm-hmm.
When I looked at that, and then we were trying to decipher what those were, and I remember feeling a sense of like pride, a sense of like, I think it becomes overwhelming when you have a sense I'm connected to a broader story,
Yeah.
and our people and all of that, that is just, you feel it in your bones.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and as Christians, we have a sort of sense of that in the sort of connecting our legacy to the Hebrew, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
Abraham, Isaac, you know, but there's not a visceral, my embodied self, people who look like me, all that, you know, and so
Mm-hmm.
integrating all of these threads, for me, that was really powerful, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I'm on
Absolutely.
a journey myself in terms of trying to understand. I'm obviously more divorced from the 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 homeland than you are. You've had much more, and you had a sort of trying to resist it, and probably now you're moving in the other direction. For me,
Mm-hmm.
I'm more divorced from it, but moving in the direction of trying to integrate all of this,
Yeah.
as a part of being proud of it, being a cultural liaison, wanting to be an ambassador to um, show broader America, right? Whether it's white or black friends or Latino friends, you know,
Mm-hmm.
um, this is what it means to be Asian American. This is what it means to be Asian.
Yeah.
This is this is a gift to offer America,
Yeah.
right? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Is that any of that resonating, or is
Sure.
that
Yeah.
analog
Absolutely.
yourself?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I think there's two things I'm hearing particularly that I want to touch on is I think as we're kind of coming closer to the end of our hour here, if I were to think about how do we move forward, right? How do we make a difference? How do we make things? What do we do to make things better? And I think in relation to what you had just touched on, um, I think when we're thinking about what are Asian cultural expressions that are like reflecting the beauty of who God is and the beauty of biblical commands of how we ought to live, there's a couple of things like this idea of like a connection to lineage, right? I think there is power in that. Now, I want to say that with the nuance, right? I think even as I say that, I know that I'm saying that from a position of privilege because for our Black brothers and sisters, the sense of lineage has been forcibly removed from them.
Yeah.
I want to speak with a sensitivity around knowing that this isn't something that everybody has access to, right? However, I do think that it is a beautiful thing, this experience that you had to be able to see yourself as a part of a broader lineage. I think that's actually very reflective of kind of third century Jewish writing, where, when you look at the book of Matthew, like the first chapter of that gospel is solely this lineage. Like, obviously, this means something to these people. I think there is beauty to draw from, particularly in the Asian expression of our faith because of our relatability to that, right? Secondly, I think this is something that's been more of a recent revelation in my own sort of journey, kind of treading through all this racial trauma stuff, right? I think another part of the beauty that is being displayed in Asian Americans or Asian people in general, our expression of the faith, is in the gift of restraint. And what I mean by that is when you look at, I was doing a podcast last week and somebody asked the question of like, what do Asian Americans do? Do we fight back or do we just say nothing. Like it feels like there's no right answer to that. And I think, this kind of dichotomy is still a very Western kind of thinking, right? I think we don't have to put, out all our eggs into one basket. I think there's different expressions. So like, the same Christ, the same Jesus Christ that went into the temple and flipped the tables was also the same Christ that walked the Via Doloroso on his way to the cross, submitting to the sentence that has been unjustly placed on his back. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like there was never a moment that this God man in Jesus Christ was disempowered. I think, to put it bluntly, even as Jesus is walking down the road in Calvary, going towards his crucifixion, he had every power within him to be able to just throw the cross or down towards the crowd and just rise up victoriously and be like, I don't want to do this. You know what I mean? But he at that moment submitted to a greater call to complete a greater vision that is for a greater good. And I think
Add to it that he was silent
mm-hmm.
with in front of Pontius Pilate, right? I think,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there is, I think that takes I think in that moment, God's power, God's strength is found in his restraint. And I think Asian heritage people have been given that gift that reflects kind of this part of the image of God, of what it looks like to find our strength in our restraint. It's not always about fighting back. It's not always about flipping a table. But there are moments where we're showing the world the humility that is found within the restraint in order to send a louder message. You know what I mean? So, yeah, so zooming out now, right, from kind of these two tangible examples of um, the Asian kind of expression of our faith, I think when I think about moving forward, when I think about stepping into this next season of the church, the capital C church, um, I really feel like I really feel convicted that we are being invited now in a time where, particularly here in America, the American church is being invited to take a seat of humility and to begin to open our ears to the teachings of particularly leaders of color.
Yeah.
Leaders of color and women, not because kind of the white male pastoral voices are not needed, but for the majority of our entire history, that's the only voice that has been given a platform.
Right.
So when we do that, what gets robbed from the Christian community is the very image of God that has been created in these other folks that are fully intended to teach us something too. So I think just to go even a little bit deeper than that, part of where I've been spending a lot of time in my readings these days is in The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby, which is a book, it's pretty recent, and he does this historical survey on just, the entire history of the American church in terms of its involvement and engagement in deeply racist systems. And what I have feel like come to the conclusion of is recognizing that there hasn't really been a single moment in our history where the American church was not complicit with racism. At best, we passively allowed it. At worst, we actively participated in it. So moving forward, I think to put our trust and put our hope in that same system, I think we're really blind to the fact that like we're just gonna get in our own way. Like something drastically needs to change. And particularly, I think the beauty of the Black church is that this is a church that has deep resilience, because this is a church that is still alive after 400 or 500 years of deliberate acts that absolutely tried to destroy you. And because of that, I think this is a church, this is a part of the body that has fully like stepped in and walked in the shoes of Christ, the suffering servant.
Yeah.
And if we're unwilling to like turn our ears in humility to learn from some of these kinds of narratives, to be at the center of what is writing the future of the church, I think we're just, I think we're just willfully ignorant, and we're going to continue to perpetuate the problems that have been a reality for people, for communities of color, for hundreds of years here. So let me just, so let me just clarify that I'm not saying that like white churches has nothing more to offer, but I think we need to look at the greater narrative of the fact that the United States of America has never had a moment of reckoning where we come into a posture of repentance for the original sin of this country. So like, so we still have like in every realm, socially, politically, there's still this fight of whether or not racism is a thing, right? Compared to some, say, a place like South Africa, not that they've done it perfectly, right? But at the very least, South Africa has come to a national repentance for the ways that apartheid was an evil thing that has drastic, profound impact to people even to today, right? We see Germany, we see Japan having sort of this national posture of repentance over the atrocities that were committed by the Nazis and by the Imperial Japanese, army during World War II. I think the United States of America has not had that humbling posture that I believe is essential if the American church wants to continue to build trust and remain relevant in a world where people are beginning to see more and more of the reality of what made us up.
And did you know I learned recently, Hitler and they learned their way of relating to racial stuff. They watched America and our way of
I have seen some of the reporting on that. So
I mean, there's a whole book on it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm with you, brother. And it depends on what angle, where does it's always about where do we start. For me, I want to start with the Asian American conversation. I want to start here.
Yeah.
To empower Asian Americans themselves to learn their own story, but also learn from the Black and the Black church. And
we didn't really mention the Native community.
Yes.
So like I think in the racial conversation, the Native community is oftentimes the one that continue to just feel like they're just always forgotten.
Right.
I have some Native staff friends that have shared this analogy of like what America feels like to them is that, America is a old house that belongs to an old grandmother, and the old grandmother is sitting in her room upstairs while the rest of the family are downstairs fighting over whose house this is, and nobody remembers that it's the grandmother's house. So
man,
I think that's
friends there too, and just the pain there, and it, you can keep going, right? It's just like them feeling like they were turned into this weird savages that, as if they didn't have any conception of or even potentially know God before the white Christians came in,
there's actually a beauty even within traditional Native spirituality that believes that that humanity is separate from creator, and in order for humanity to be reconciled to creator, they need a mediator. I mean, that's pretty fertile ground for the gospel. You know what I'm saying? So we're doing a lot of cool, exciting stuff in our ministry that has that kind of deep level contextualization. And I really believe that that is the future. Like if the church fails to learn how to contextualize the gospel to be a relevant thing to people whose need for the good news might look different, then we're just a nationalistic religious system that continues to prey on marginalized people groups. So
Danny, we could probably go for hours, but
absolutely.
I want to thank you. I mean, I really pray that, I pray that your perspectives, your voice, and your that you can get an opportunity. I know that in the kingdom of God, we're not about. I always hesitate with like language like platforms and like, you know, so I don't even want to say that you get a platform because that's not even the language I would prefer. I would say that
Mm,
I pray that God gives you greater opportunity to serve, say it that way,
mm, yeah,
and to allow um, you to be a blessing, right? Which is the opportunity, and to have a godly influence
yeah.
on the people around you and culture. So, but
Mm,
yeah, let me close this out by perhaps inviting you to say a prayer, a benediction over the things we were talking about, the
yeah,
Asian American community. Wherever your God leads your mind in
sure.
us.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, let's pray. Father in heaven, we come to you in uh, just such a time where everything has been so disoriented by this pandemic, by racial trauma, by just news that grieve us every day. And it's easy to remain in a place of cynicism and desperation, to uh, wonder if anything good can come out of this. But Lord, we just remember to set our eyes back on the end of Revelation when you describe this picture of a new heaven, a new earth, to this reality when you come and bring the full restoration of the kingdom, for this time where you are going to make all things new, that we will be fully reconciled to you and fully reconciled to each other. That is the place that I want to set my hope on. So would you uh, help us to not set that hope on political systems or even the institution of the church itself, um, but allow us to believe that you, the restorer of all things, has already started a revolution that is activating believers of like ourselves who want to see that kingdom vision come to reality, um, to wait expectantly, and to pursue actively with the very expressions of our faith. Would you give us the hope of seeing that being the end goal? So, yeah, we love you and we ask that you would replenish us and refuel us, and give us moments of rest and joy as we all join together in the same fight. So we thank you, we love you, we praise you, and we ask for all these things in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks for spending the time, brother.
Thanks, man.